great pleasure to welcome you to today's very special event. Just before we begin, it sounds a little bit Big Brother, but we are going live. Please do not swear. So if everyone can put their phones on silent, we're live streaming over the web. So hello everyone joining us online. There we go. Yeah. Hello everyone. We do hope that you'll get involved with the discussion on Twitter as well. Please keep your questions coming. There's someone monitoring it, and when we kind of open up to the floor later, we'll be taking questions from yourselves and social as well. Please use the hashtag #RSATimesUp. So, as that hashtag suggests, this event is using that as its starting point. It's the incredible movement that has gathered strength in the last few months. But before we kind of jump straight in there, I would like to welcome our brilliant panel today, who have generously given up their time to join in the discussion. I'm sure you will be well aware of their work, so I will keep all introductions succinct. We are delighted to have with us today Ayesha Hazarika. I knew I was going to mess that up. Evening Standard columnist, comedian and political commentator. Down the end here, Helen Pankhurst, campaigner, author of new book Deeds Not Words, and, as I'm sure all of you will be aware, great-granddaughter of pioneering suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst. Then we have Laura Bates, activist, founder of the renowned Everyday Sexism website, and author of brand new book, hot off the press, Misogynation, love that title, and to my left, Sophie Walker, founding leader of the Women's Equality Party. What an all-star lineup. Please give them all a big round of applause. So, before we get started, we're just going to bat some ideas around, two of us, and kind of just soak up the collective wisdom in the room. But I guess let's kick off as to why we're here. I mean, it's such a pivotal moment, I think, in this movement. And I think for me, it's twofold in terms of over the last 12 months, there's been so many monumental events and breaking news happening, wave after wave of kind of outrage and activism. For me, it kind of started with the Women's March last year, the reaction to Trump. Then we kind of went on to Weinstein and Me Too. And the rest of the revelations that followed, the Larry Nassar and the testimonials given that we've seen recently, the Time's Up movement, the Golden Globes, the wearing of the black, the President's Club revelations, Oxfam most recently. I think the tidal wave has created such momentum and acknowledgement that this systemic abuse of power and sexual discrimination cannot happen. But then at the same time, there's so many historical things that we're now being reminded of some really important battles in the past. And we're kind of being forced to measure that progress. So obviously, recently we celebrated 100 years since the first women in the UK were granted the right to vote, which was February the 6th, and Helen worked with Stylist magazine to produce a special edition for that, which went down brilliantly. But also this year we have the centenary of the first woman to be elected to the House of Commons. So we have all of these anniversaries that are forcing us to look back and measure how far we've come, but also assess what we have yet to do. So those two things for me that have merged together are kind of really making this a really important time. So I'd just like to pass over to Ayesha. What do you think? What are you most interested in right now out of all the things that are happening?
Well, I think, we've had this incredible sort of explosion globally with the Me Too campaign. And I remember I wrote this article for the Standard sort of in the midst of the Sexminster sort of scandals coming to light. And it was when Storm Ophelia had sort of come to London. I don't know if you remember the sort of sky went this really eerie colour of pink. So above the House of Commons, it was this kind of fierce pink. And I thought, yeah, that is revenge. That is women's revenge, basically. And so it's been this kind of huge outpouring. And I think, for me, the person who summed it up the best in terms of how we all collectively feel about having lived and struggled and just got on with all the brilliantly phrased everyday sexism that Laura brilliantly captured was, I don't know if you saw that episode, Have I Got News for You, in the midst of all of this stuff, and it was Jo Brand. She was the female anchor. It was an all-male panel, and they kind of sort of laughed it off about how insecure, how kind of what a load of nonsense it was. And what I loved about Jo Brand's response was she didn't actually come back with a super sharp ha-ha-ha. She just said, do you know what? We are tired by all of this. We are just ground down by this, because it has been, you know, years, decades, centuries, if you like. And I thought, to me, that kind of captures sort of where we are. So to sort of get to the sort of germane point of your question, I think we're at a really, really important moment, but a hashtag movement does not make a social revolution. It's really good that we have all been tweeting furiously away, and that, you know, we've done lots of, you know, we saw lots of really, really important gestures at the, we saw them at the Grammys, we saw them at the Golden Globes, I'm sure we'll see them at the BAFTAs as well. But I think, as somebody who's worked in politics for the last 20 years, since 1997, where real power lies is still very much the optic of what the patriarchy looks like. When I was a political advisor, I actually worked in politics for a long time. I was a special advisor for Harriet Harman, Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband. That went really well, obviously. Yeah. Did also advise the Remain campaign. That went well. And I found that, you know, I worked really, really hard to get to a kind of senior position as being an advisor. And being a political advisor is really, really, really interesting, because the front of house in politics is very important. Having more women MPs is brilliant, and we must strive for that. But in any business, you have to look at where real power lies in a structure. And it's often behind a closed door in a room with all the really, really important people, some of whom you'll never know their names. They're not elected. The sort of chief of staff, the head of policy, the director of communications, they're the director of strategy. They're the big boys in politics, in the same way that they'll be the big boys that run organisations or you know, newsrooms or that type of thing. And I remember fighting really, really hard to get into that room. And when I got into that room, I noticed that everybody around me was basically a kind of a white man from Oxford or Cambridge who had studied the same topic, some sort of PPE type thing. They had all gone to the same types of schools, they had the same outlook on the world, and they were all basically called Bob, Tom and Simon. There were so few people who looked like me in the upper echelons of politics that people used to get me confused for Saeeda Varsi quite a lot. I know, I don't know who that was worse for, to be honest. And so, you know, being the only woman in the room means you don't, it's very difficult to sort of, you know, have a voice when the dominant consensus is one sort of view. And I think that is the problem with where we are in terms of power. And the irony about the Me Too and the Time's Up and all the sexual harassment, and we've all probably, you will all know this, people make the mistake that it's about sex, it's something kind of flirty and fun. It's not, it's about power. It's about an abuse of power, and it's a mindset that a lot of men have, even unwittingly, that cometh a certain position in an organisation, cometh privilege. And what that privilege also means is sort of sexual privileges as well. And, of course, all the kind of unconscious sort of bias that we see. So I suppose where I'd like to see the conversation going is we've raised the issue, we've kind of smashed through this thing of not talking about it. I mean, I remember even not that long ago, I worked for Harriet Harman, who obviously has been pushing these issues for a long, long time, when it was deeply unfashionable. We weren't even allowed to say the word feminist a couple of years ago. Even in the Labour Party, we weren't even allowed to call one of our panels at our women's conference feminist, because it was like seen as too subversive. So we're at this incredibly important time, but we must not think that because we've got lots of celebrities, because we're getting lots of coverage, because, you know, you've got everybody using Time's Up as a sort of a fashion statement, that the work is done. We have such a long way to go. And even though we have made many, many strides 100 years on from women, some women first getting the vote, you know, we have a female Prime Minister, we have a female First Minister in Scotland, but, you know, that does not make, you know, a feminist nirvana, because I'll just give you a statistic which I think is really powerful. Of the 4 great officers of state in this country, only 5 women have ever held those positions, including Theresa May. And what a monumental waste of talent and opportunity. And also, just think of the money they could have saved on the wage bill.
Nice one. Nice one to end on that one. Laura, can I ask you to jump in and give your two penneth at this point?
Yes, I think I couldn't agree more. I think we're at this incredibly exciting, wonderful moment where so many courageous people, a huge number of women and some men, have spoken out about something that has for so long been stigmatized and silenced and disbelieved. But we have to fight against the people who want to say, great, that's it, job done, you know, tick the box. We've all talked about it now, so the problem's over. We have to recognize that this moment of revealing the problem is just the beginning, and the real work is in fixing the problem, and that comes next. And that work can't just be foisted onto the women who've come forward. We've seen so much backlash, you know, so many front-page newspaper articles either suggesting that women are making it up, that they're making a fuss about nothing. Why didn't she do this? Why didn't she do that? Why didn't she come forward sooner? Why didn't she report it? Even, you know, unbelievable articles, you know, like the one that suggested that putting a kiss at the end of an email may now ruin a man's career. We've seen real anxiety about this, and we have to be very careful that we don't keep asking these questions of women. It's not why didn't she, why didn't she, why didn't she do this? It's why did he? And how do we stop him? How do we not do that? And what are men doing to sort of start changing that conversation as well? What's the government doing? What are organisations and businesses doing? Because this is structural. It's not an issue that can be solved by individuals reacting in the right way that we prescribe women should be reacting. And of course, it also won't be won, this battle, until we're seeing it have a trickle-down impact. It isn't a coincidence that we're hearing about these stories, that this huge kind of coming together and spotlight on these issues has come out now when it's been highlighted by extremely beautiful, privileged white women in Hollywood, which isn't to say that those issues they're highlighting aren't enormously important. They are, and they must be tackled. But we also have to recognise the hundreds of thousands of women experiencing this kind of prejudice and abuse on a daily basis in their own workplaces, often compounded by other forms of prejudice, whether that's racism or transphobia or prejudice on grounds of their religion or disability, who aren't necessarily being heard at all yet in this debate. And we need to look at how we solve this problem in a way that is structural so that it has an impact for them as well. When we did a survey on workplace sexual harassment last year at the Everyday Sexism Project, we found that over half of all women experience it, and over 2/3 of young women. But we also found that those most vulnerable to it were those on 0 hours contracts, women in extremely low paid positions. And so when we have a conversation where we say, well, why didn't she go to her HR department? If you look at the stories we're receiving at Everyday Sexism, there was no HR department. This is somebody who has a cash in hand job and will be sent home if she objects to sexual harassment. So what do you do then? How do we tackle that? And I think we have to really fight for that structural change, for this to be seen as an institutional issue, not one of individuals, in order for that to really happen in practice. But I also think that we're fighting against the perception that the problem is solved and that there is no work to be done anymore. So often when I talk about these issues, I come up against this argument, sexism doesn't really exist anymore in the UK. Look elsewhere, people often say. Look at other countries around the world. And there is this real sense women here are making a fuss about things that aren't real problems. And I think that we have to sometimes stop and reflect on the fact that actually we are still living in a country where fewer than 1/3 of our elected MPs are women, only about 1/5 of the leadership of the membership of the House of Lords. Anywhere there are decisions being made that impact on our lives on a daily basis, they're being made by usually older white men. In our judiciary, for example, only 18 out of 108 High Court judges are women. Only 7 out of 38 Lord Justices of Appeal are women. In terms of the way that the world is framed for us, the news that we consume on a daily basis, the front pages that shape the way that we react to what's going on, just over 1/5 of them are written by women, and 84% of them are about a male subject or expert. So in ways that we don't even realise, these things are trickling down. And, you know, it's vital to recognise when people tell us, look elsewhere, when they try to perform this sleight of hand that says these problems aren't worth talking about, that actually we're living in a country where there remains a big gender pay gap, which widens for women of colour, where 1 in 4 women experiences domestic violence, and that number raises to 1 in 2 for disabled women, where 85,000 women are raped every year and 400,000 sexually assaulted, where 2 women a week, on average, are still killed by a current or former partner. So the argument that we don't have a problem to solve, the argument that we're overreacting, and the argument that women should just do something differently and it would go away, they're all wrong, but they're all pernicious. They're all about making us look the other way, about making us blame somebody else. And I think we have to look at the way in which these debates are framed, and most of all, perhaps more than anything else, to tackle the normalization that says this is the way it's always been, so just get on with it, so just deal with it. And for me, that's particularly relevant sitting in this room, because I gave a talk to a media company, which will remain nameless, in this room some months ago. And it was a talk about everyday sexism, and I was planning to kind of highlight the background of this issue. And when I arrived, the organisers of the event said, we've had to just change your PowerPoint a little bit. We've taken a couple of your slides out. So I said, oh, really? And they said, yes, well, first of all, we've taken out the slide about statistics on violence against women because we just think it might make some of the men feel quite uncomfortable. Oh, my God. Yeah, genuinely. And then, she said, we've also had to remove one of your slides, which was for your discussion about the objectification of women in the media. And this was a slide which had a composite of about 100 very tiny images of women to make the point that of the thousands of women's pictures we're bombarded with every day, we think we see thousands of women's bodies, but we don't. We see one woman's body 1,000 times. If you put them all side by side, you suddenly realise it's the same very thin, very young, white-skinned, large-breasted, long-legged model with long blonde hair, usually heavily made up. So I had this slide, and in these tiny thumbnail pictures, they said some of the women seemed to be naked or not wearing very much, so we had to take it down. And I had to say to them, I see, well, that's fine, but what are you going to do about them? And it's just... Isn't that amazing to be sitting in this room and be told you can't show images of a woman's breast to make a point about objectification, but of course women who've been painted in this way by a male painter for the male gaze for generations, that's absolutely fine. So there is so much that's baked into our society around us, and it's all about seeing those normalised things that we've been told for such a long time. You just have to put up with this. It's just the way things are. Well, it's not anymore, and it's time to say enough's enough.
Thank you. I'm just going to clap for your retort there. I mean, this room was a bit of a gift for that.
It was, yeah.
But thank you. A lot of those statistics as well are quite sobering when you just kind of rattle through them like that, and they just kind of make you take your breath away a little bit. Helen, can I move over to you? I mean, obviously you have a brilliant kind of pedigree to look back at our achievements, but you know, you've written a whole book on what is to be achieved now, moving forward, what we have achieved and what we really haven't. So it'd be great to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, so I started this book just over 2 years ago, and at the time I thought, well, a few people might be interested in the centenary, and feminists and a little bit of the media, and little did I know how it would resonate. And there really is something that's going on at the moment, which means that those stories of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers, their fight seems particularly relevant. And it's not just because of the problem. It's not just because of those statistics that Laura has just shared with us that would resonate from the past. But it's because of that's enough. We've got to do something. That spirit that's there now saying, come on, it's our generation, we have to do something. So it's just wonderful to see this excitement and sense that the battle is really in our hands, and people feeling, okay, well, what can we do? At the end of the book, I refer to a decade of action, that we've got 10 years, because we're celebrating the centenary of that first partial gain, that really symbolically important one, the one that people thought would open the door to so many issues. But it was only partial. Women had to wait another 10 years for equal franchise. Well, we've got 10 years, as far as I'm concerned, 10 years to the centenary of equal franchise, and it's up to us to use that 10 years. Many other issues I could share in terms of the parallel. One of the ones I'm always asked about is about why. Why are people interested in the suffragettes in particular? There's a cultural appropriation, or maybe that's the wrong word, but there's a real cultural love and interest in the suffragettes, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. The first is because they were right. They were right to challenge the state. They were right to challenge that business as usual in the sense that this would continue and slowly would work. They said enough, as we are saying enough. And, right around the world now, globally, there's acceptance that things had to change. The second is that enormous sacrifice. I mean, the degree to which women went, the torture that they experienced, and the endless patience that was required of them. And in a way, I think we're saying thanks, and possibly also we're understanding that in our time, there's still that need for perseverance. There's still that need for incredible sacrifice. In the UK, we have a democratic space, and we don't have to go to prison for our demands. By and large, in many countries around the world, even the smallest act of defiance is still treated with the same type of appalling vitriol that they experienced 100 years ago. The third element, I think, that's fascinating about them is that they were cross-party political and they were cross-sector. And they're not portrayed in that way. They're portrayed as middle-class women. Often, I think they're portrayed as linked to the Conservative Party. They were not. They came right across. And yes, it wasn't perfect. There were schisms that obviously they represented. But in many ways, their ideas were very novel in trying to bring women together across party political affiliations and across many other differences. And the fourth aspect, which I think is possibly at the heart of it all, is they were fun, and they had fun, and they had all these really bizarre ideas about how to keep things in the media. They were so clever. They were so clever in terms of messaging, you know, the fact that ideas, the colours, the purple, green and white colours, the simple slogan, Votes for Women, emerging as such a strong, powerful statement. And, you know, the number of just really interesting things that they got involved in is, I just keep on hearing new stories and I'm just amazed. So I think with that spirit, if we can also continue to be as creative as we can in our fight now, I think that's a really important lesson. In this book, I go through the heritage bit, so I look back in the prologue, and then, as I've mentioned, in the epilogue, I look forward. And in between, I look at thematic areas. And I look at politics as the first, money as the second, identity as the third, violence against women as the fourth, and culture as the fifth. And then I wrap it up to look at power. It's about power and sexuality, really. And the reason I'm listing all of that is that there's, and it's quite detailed, it's quite detailed, but at the end of each really meaty chapter, I also encourage myself to to summarise and assess and give a score from 1 to 5 of each of the areas. And I encourage the reader to do that as well. And there is no doubt whatsoever that the one area that scores the weakest is around violence against women. Violence against women is that opposite of power. It's that area that we are all then put back into our box around. And it's all pervasive. It infects the chapter on politics. It infects the chapter on money. It infects the chapter on women's personal spaces and culture. So although I don't think that this is, 100 years ago it was the vote. They thought unlock that and everything else would follow. They always knew there'd be more to do. In some senses, I feel that violence against women is the one area that we really, really cannot ignore, but there's so many others. And in particular, it's the social sphere. It's issues around, so not so much social sphere, it's issues around social norms that are the ones that really need to change. The ideas about the right to abuse others, the ideas about entitlement, right across. And this isn't just about feminism, this is about power, the abuse of power. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Finally, Sophie,
no pressure.
Yeah. Well, I guess moving from the suffragettes into a brilliant example of direct action. I mean, you just didn't feel like any party was representing you or a lot of your peers, and so therefore you went out and created the party yourself, which is brilliant. So I'd love to get some of your thoughts on all of
Sure.
this.
Well, first of all, I didn't create it myself.
You had a few. You had a few mates.
We created it. A whole bunch of people came together because they'd had enough. And I think it's really lovely being on a panel with a bunch of people you agree with, because women are so often set up as we have to debate whether women's equality is a thing. The number of times the BBC invites me and says, well, we're going to have, for the interest of fairness, we're going to have somebody argue that women's equality is really stupid and unnecessary. And I'm like... one of the things that I think is really important in terms of us taking this forward is about practical solutions and being political in all that we do. Because it's no surprise that the Me Too movement rolled through media and entertainment and politics first, because those are the real bastions of male power. They are the places where men tell stories about male power that normalises the male voice and maintains women as second-class citizens. And so there's some really practical stuff we can do around how we change that in the media and entertainment. I'm hoping we'll get a chance to talk about that later on. But for me, it's about politics, obviously, because I think we have to look at politics differently. We have to understand that feminism is a political ideology in and of itself. It is not a nice to have. It's not the thing you do afterwards. Too often we get stuck between these sort of opposing views that you can either, women's equality will happen when individual women just get better at being women, which is something, it's the sort of, it's the classic white man meritocracy. I just want the right person for the job, which basically means I want someone who looks and sounds just like me. And women have been fed this story that if the barriers that you face are yours and yours alone, so if you didn't get that pay rise, it's because you didn't ask for it, right? And if you've got bad body image, you should just run a bit more, or take up yoga, or meditation, or clean eating. And you should also be an excellent parent. So read all those books on good parenting as well. You should also be terribly sexy in all that you do, so make sure that you are getting that bit right as well. So we have this generation of women who are running and doing yoga and trying to figure out how to ask for a pay rise and be a perfect parent and bake, and they're knackered. And we're all knackered. And it's time to say the problem's not us. The problem is patriarchy. And so a politics that says just be a better woman is not a politics that's going to work. And at the same time, a politics that says after the revolution, sisters, also not a politics that's going to work. So the idea that we can come at this through class, for example, is simply not one that is ever going to fix things for women, because women always are told that we'll get to you next. And that was what propelled me into politics, because I was really tired of being offered these two alternatives by politicians who still thought that they had my vote in their back pocket. So it wasn't even like we have to try a bit harder because we think we're missing people here. It was, no, we'll get round to you. Just keep voting for us and it'll be fine. And the risk, I think, here is really interesting. We've got to make all of the other political parties understand that risk is not new parties with new ideas. Risk is all the old parties who let you down year after year after year and who need to start doing something differently. And the cross-party element of what we're doing, as Helen was saying with the suffragettes, is absolutely vital. Because the other thing we have to challenge is that politics is about throwing rocks at each other. You know, that we all get into our trenches and we all chuck stones and shout at each other. That's easy. That's so easy to do politics like that. The hardest job in politics is to get out of your trenches and walk into no man's land and say, where can you meet me on this? What can we get done? And being non-partisan has got this sort of reputation as being a bit wishy-washy. It's a bit like we'll all just sort of sit on the fence. It's not. It requires nerves of steel. And that is what you should be requiring of your politicians. Because what's been said here is absolutely right. This is structural. This is not about fiddling around on the edges. One of the things I get asked most of all is, what's the one thing you want? And I sort of think, well, I'm the leader of the Women's Equality Party. Is that not quite clear? But I think actually it masks, and what it masks is, what is the one thing you want? Right? There's a silver bullet. If we can just figure out what the one thing is, we'll fix it. There is no one thing. It requires equality of our education. It requires equality of care. It requires equality of representation. It requires ending violence against women. It requires a structural, cohesive, collaborative, joined-up approach, and don't ever settle for anything less. I'm going to finish in 1 minute, but the thing I would leave you with is, look at how our institutions have responded to Me Too and to Time's Up. Sexual harassment in Westminster. Well, we just need better reporting systems. Austerity is hitting women more than anybody else. Yeah, we'll just tinker around the edges with that. Austerity is the end product of an economic process that is totally broken, and we will never fix it by working within the same structures. We will never have women's equality while we work within the same structures that are causing it. So be activists, be political, and don't ask for permission to do it differently. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the floor in a minute because I'd love to get you all involved in the discussion. So I guess with your rallying cry to be activists and our kind of observations that the movement has become all about big issues, big institutions, major figures, kind of drawing attention to it. But how do we bring it back to the everyday? How do we all bring it back to the everyday and the issues that are kind of affecting our lives and the people that we know in it? I'd like to just go down the panel and if you could name the one thing that
you're doing it now.
No, well, you know what I mean? we've got 25 minutes live, but the most important thing then, the most important way that people can be involved themselves and be activists themselves?
My theory is we need to bring three things together. We need to bring individual agency, women's agency, men's agency, women's agency in saying, I need to change things, that whatever's happening in my life, I can do more. That will change social norms, the general attitudes, the ideas. And then we also still need to look at the law. And if we bring those three together, that's what will achieve change. So I don't think that, I echo what Sophie's just said. I don't think there's a single issue, but I think all of us can do so much in terms of our little area of agency, in terms of getting involved in wider discussions, and in terms of looking what's happening with the law. Is it the application of the law, or is it new law that's needed?
Yeah, activism. There's this idea that politics happens in Westminster, and it really doesn't. It really doesn't, does it? You've been in lots of rooms where there's not a lot happening, right? Westminster happens, politics happens on your doorsteps. It happens in your communities. It happens when you get together with other like-minded people. I think you don't have to be told how to do politics. You can absolutely invent it. And I think that there's something really important in deciding what matters for you locally, particularly because women are so poorly represented in local government. So most of the decisions that are being made in your communities are being made by men, locally as well as nationally. And that is where you start to challenge ideas that, for example, functioning childcare, functioning social care, functioning education systems are a nice to have rather than fundamental to the well-being of your communities. I think there's something also very powerful in understanding, again, and I'm repeating myself a bit here, that the strength of your resistance is in your linked arms. And the more of you that are mobilised, the more effective you can be.
Okay. Aisha, how do you think we can bring it back to the everyday, these huge issues?
Well, I suppose what I probably have slight divergence. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything that Sophie says because I'm not an idiot. But I do think politics absolutely has to be bottom up, but also you have to look at politics where it is now. I wish we could sort of wave a magic wand and change everything. So I'd sort of say a couple of things really. I would urge parties give it the big one about equality and gender equality at the moment. Everybody loves equality. Everyone bangs on about equality. Everyone loves a photo call with lots of women and people of colour around them. But I would ask political leaders to put their money where their mouth is. I would ask them to sign up to quotas for women, people of colour. Class is a really big issue in politics as well. Diversity is not just your gender or the colour of your skin. It's also diversity of thought as well, which is really, really important. So I think class is a really big issue in all of this. And that's not just for elected positions. And you're right, local government's really, really important. I would say it's those backroom jobs that I was talking about as well, because you're absolutely right about the big decisions in this country get taken by quite a small group of men in a room, actually, whether it's coming up with what's going to be in the manifesto or deciding what's going to be in the budget. And, you can't have the real lived experiences of women or people of colour or anybody from a different background if they're not in the room. So I think that is absolutely germane. I would actually like there to be no all-male policy meetings or no all male or all white. You know, I'd like there to be real. I think that's one thing that like all political parties and actually organisations should sign up to as well. The second thing, really, really quickly, is the amplification of women's and underrepresented groups' voices. So one of the brilliant things about everyday sexism was the fact that it exposed just how horrible it is out there being a woman on social media or having a voice, and the amount of horrible aggression that you get. And what that's designed to do is to sort of silence you, and it can be quite effective, whether it comes from the right, whether it comes from the left, you know, wherever it comes from. And it is amazing how that does. If you're a young woman starting out, you're inspired by, you know, the women on this panel. You want to have a voice. You might write a blog, or you might tweet, and suddenly you've got all these people piling in on you, telling you you're stupid, this, that, the next thing, or even worse. So I think we've all got a responsibility to do that, because it is really, really tough out there in social media. I got some really horrible messages. I got one that said quite recently, why don't you spend less time slagging off Jeremy Corbyn and more time down the gym? That was from my mum. She loves Jeremy Corbyn.
Brilliant. Laura, how do you want us to bring this back to the everyday?
Well, I think it's important that we don't think of it as a split between politics and the everyday. And I think that we can all have an impact in terms of really standing together to push for political change where it needs to happen. I think that we need to see the government taking action on some quite specific areas. You know, for example, all of this stuff is coming out about workplace sexual harassment, but shamefully and shockingly, under the last government, Section 40 of the Equalities Act was repealed. And that section meant that employers were responsible for protecting their employees from third-party harassment in the workplace. In other words, harassment that comes from a client rather than a colleague. So, you know, a member of bar staff being sexually harassed by a punter in the pub, a hospital worker being sexually harassed by a patient. Under the law at the moment, they're not protected from that. That is something the government could change. Things like maternity discrimination, which 54,000 women a year lose their jobs because of, 1 in 8 of all pregnant women. And at the moment, the rules say that you've got 3 months to bring a tribunal claim. Those first 3 months of your baby's life, when you've got nothing else really going on that you need to do, that could be changed like that. That could make a big difference. So there are areas, and that's not a case of going, oh, well, that's political, we can't. That's a case of standing together and really fighting on these issues. You know, the government at the moment is proposing to make changes to short-term housing fund benefits, which will mean that women's refuges will be stripped of their very last remaining source of secure funding. And Women's Aid has said that 40% of their refuges might close their doors for good as a result. And people will die. Women will die because of that. So there are specific things we can really be calling on the government to do. There are campaign groups we can support, you know, campaign groups like Women for Refugee Women, who are campaigning against the detention of refugee women who are survivors of sexual violence in Yarl's Wood. Campaigns like the ongoing campaigns around period poverty. There are girls in the UK missing school because they don't have access to sanitary protection. We can actively support those campaigns with our voices, by turning up, and with funding as well. And I think there are also ways in our own lives that we can have a massive impact, much more perhaps than we'd like to think. The way that we speak to our children is so enormously important. They are the future. At the moment, they're experiencing sexual harassment and assault in school, and they're witnessing it online in online porn, which we want to think we can bury our heads in the sand about, but actually 60% of them have seen it by the time they're 14. 1 rape per school day on average is currently being reported to UK police as having happened inside UK schools. There's a recent BBC investigation that discovered 5,500 sexual offences, including 600 rapes, which works out at 1 rape per school day because it was over a 3-year period. So we desperately need to educate young people about their rights to their own bodies, about their responsibilities, about sexual consent and what a healthy relationship looks like. And how we behave in our own small sphere has such an enormous knock-on impact, not only on the children who look to us for what's normal in the way that we respond, but to the people around us. When I was sexually assaulted on a bus and I said out loud what was happening, every single person on that bus looked out the window. And I got off the bus at the next stop and walked the rest of the way home because I felt like it was my fault. Because everybody went, this is your thing, you deal with it, don't bring this into the public domain. It sent me the message, this is your problem to deal with, and everyone thinks this is okay. And it was years later before I realised the man on the bus that day got a message as well, which was, this is absolutely fine. You go ahead, you carry on. And until enough of us turn our heads when it happens, make eye contact, do the difficult work of disrupting those norms, nothing will change.
Thank you. I'd like to open some questions